Yeah, hello and welcome to this speech, which will be about Russian pronunciation of the English language. This speech will basically be in, I suppose, around 10 to 15 minutes, and it's just a preparation of mine that I have chosen to record. So, we'll start off right now. In this speech, I'll describe one of the varieties of the English language, namely Russian pronunciation, which we'll often refer to as Russian English, or simply Russian accent. First of all, we'll take a deep look and compare the Russian pronunciation of several letters, especially vowels, and the accents that is produced by a native speaker of Russian. Secondly, we'll compare different kinds of Russian pronunciations, so this will be like a general overview, such as Hollywood Russian, Russian English 60+, and the street language. Finally, we'll investigate the way this accent is interpreted by a native English speaker. As we know, there is a certain way letters are being pronounced in Russian English. Usually, the vowels are taken directly from the Russian language and put it into English, without any change. So, vowels are pronounced dividedly. So, if I would take as an example, A is like A, E is more like Ye, I is I, O is O, U is U, and Y, I don't think there is such a word, such a sound in Russian English, or in Russian. Consonants have a sharp, hard sound, such as B, that turns into B, D turns into D, L turns into L, V turns into V, P turns into P, R turns into R, T turns into T. And as you can see, it seems like it requires a lot of strength to pronounce these. But for a native speaker of Russian, this is the easiest way. Sometimes W is more likely to be pronounced in the same way as V. So, for instance, if I would say every, that word would sound like every, v, because there is no V, no W sound in Russian. Because there is no TH sound or th sound in Russian, it might be replaced by s or z occasionally. So, and this basically depends on the sentence, of course. Probably in some cases I've seen this to be I've seen some use s and some use z, but that's basically something that depends, and of course it depends on the situation. So, for instance, this is very interesting. That's basically, this is very interesting, and you can probably hear it. Long R are also important to point out, because sometimes native speaker of English tends to avoid even pronouncing it, and sometimes not even, avoiding it entirely, because or especially in some dialects, which is important to notice here. But in Russian R is long, and it's not like a German or a French R, I would say, nor Swedish R, but it's like r. So you're rolling. That's like rolling. Yeah, quite a long sound, I'd say. And interesting enough, it's not only the way they are pronounced which matters, but in fact the way when they're being pronounced. So, for instance, for example, every letter, that's just a sentence that I would actually say would sound as every letter. With a hidden vowel ye, or e, excuse me here, which native speakers tend to avoid pronouncing, is being pronounced by a Russian speaker. Sounds like, it basically sounds like when someone is learning English, it's we could agree here, but not entirely, because, for instance, if I would take, I don't know how to find the way back, that's the sentence I would like to pronounce. In Russian English, it would sound like, I do not know how to find a way back home. Of course, that differs. That differs a lot. It depends on who you ask, because if you look at the former Soviet states, for instance, and if you look at them and you analyze, you'll see that there are quite big differences between each republic. And but now we're talking about Russian pronunciation, so of course it tends to be the same, or we have at least some general trends, but it depends on the person as well. Really, it's heavily relying on that. Russian version of the Russian English has deep roots in the way Russian pronounced sounds that are in common in the English language and the Russian language. Hollywood Russian is also a variety I will cover today. So, Hollywood Russian is the first variety of the Russian English, which has its origin from different American shooting movies and games. It's emphasizing the general trends, as described before, and it makes them sound even more Russian, in quotation marks. I would refer sometimes to it to be like some kind of monotonic and really smooth accent, because no, wait a minute, excuse me. It's vulgar and brutal accent. Smooth will come later. It's really, we can really agree on this, that it's broken English. Sometimes you can say it's mysterious. It has no feelings, and I would say that's the general feedback that we could probably give to this variety. According to some research done by me, I think this accent is actually having some kind of origin from the Cold War time, as obviously in order to be viewed as the bad guys, in order to keep this cold-blooded stereotype. Yeah, and that's one of the main reasons, because I mean, when you're looking at movies, as mentioned here, it's really brutal. It's like showing they don't have any soul at all, or yeah, soul question might be discussed. It might be argued if there is such a term as soul, but still, I hope you get what I mean here. That probably cold-blooded person would be much better. So that's basically how it probably sound when you hear this accent first time. And now, remember, we are talking about Hollywood Russian English, so it's not like a way Russians tend to speak. That's American, US invented accent, or Western invented accent, if we would split up the world in that way. For instance, as an example here, I think I could try to say a short sentence, and please consider that this is a sentence in Hollywood Russian English, so it's not the general trends that I'm going to discuss. So, for instance, hello, Dmitry. You probably know what I told you yesterday about Comrade Malenkov. Comrade Malenkov, it depends. One of the things you need to put is actually comrade, because that's something you need to include that in order to sound more Russian, and once again in quotation marks. Because, yeah, comrades is something really special, and now once again it refers to the Soviet time, to this communist regime, and so on and so forth. And Dmitry is really, it's a common name, so that's why I took it. Yes. Now let's look a little bit on Russian English 60+. And I should have probably mentioned that it's actually between 40 and 60, and it refers to those with a Soviet past. And now I would say this is the accent that is smooth, it's monotonic, it's not emphasizing the outfits that much. Although these are still present, so we can we might hear some these trends that we've been discussing in the first part of this speech, and but still they're not emphasized in the way Hollywood Russian tends to emphasize those trends. And it's not similar to Russian English. That's one thing we need to look at. I mean, Russian English is the way Americans, if we would divide it, or you American English-speaking people are trying to pronounce Russian, or like trying to sound as they would be as if they would be Russians, and they are trying to pronounce it as those people. But and I would say that's the normal accent, because that is actually that is the normal accent if we would compare it to Hollywood Russian, which is something I don't have any comments on. But this is more likely, you're more likely to hear someone talking like this than Hollywood Russian. And I would like to actually read an article here, which is taken from RT.com. Politics prepares Russian reply Magnitsky 705. So basically it's an article, but the content doesn't matter here, I would like to say. So let's start. So I'll just read the text in normal English or standard English, or at least I will try to do it, and then I will read it in Russian English. So, Russian State Duma is to approve the draft law targeting U.S. citizens involved in the human rights violations, which is seen as the response to the so-called Magnitsky Bill approved by the Senate last week. Let's now try to pronounce this in Russian English. Russian State Duma is due to approve the draft law targeting U.S. citizens involved in human rights violations, which is seen as a response to the so-called Magnitsky Bill, approved by the Senate last week. I shouldn't probably have had this low voice, but that's once again I'm going back to Hollywood Russian English, because that's the way I've been hearing Russian English, like from movies and games, and for some reason now when I'm trying to produce this accent, I add those features that shouldn't actually be there. But however, as I said, this is the normal accent. Let's now move on the street language. So Russian English, parentheses, street language. So, street language is a version of Russian English. It is of a great importance because it differs from the general way of speaking Russian English. In fact, the way it sounds is similar to the street languages in Russia, an accent produced by young people who want to portray them as cool, in quotation marks. I didn't know how to really say cool here, but just youth language probably. It's a language of young people. And obviously it contains a lot of swear words because it's street language. It's low language. It's basically on a low level. Doesn't that's probably not my opinion, but it's like if you would compare just the Russian street language, it's okay, in some sense it is developing language, but still it's a street language, and as usual it depends on the context. But in this case, those with or like someone having this in background and trying to speak English might produce this accent. And I would say this is a typical result of the Russian way of learning English in school. And this is now in general, because I'm not trying to... It might be argued here. I'm not trying to say that all the schools in the country are doing studying English in that way. Of course, there are private schools. There are other schools that probably keep up better with this, but this is just a general my general observation of schools in Russia. So it's a typical result of Russian way of learning English. it's like listening at radio, or like some kind of radio course in Russia. I don't know. That's my um, how I would refer to it. And this accent is not that much monotonic, as it goes up and down and emphasizes different vowels, which is typical Russian. So I'm not good at reading anything in this accent, but I would like to try. I think yes, and the text I'm going to read now is basically it's the same article as mentioned previously, and I'll try to read it. So the document was developed jointly by all parliamentary parties, and it could be approved at the first reading as early as Tuesday. The current version does not contain a list of particular names, but simply provides a sensitive section against U.S. citizen who had violated. Okay, it sounds a bit dreadful here, but that is how it might sound. And once again, that's just like a general accent, I would say. That's, however, is it's not some sort of. I mean, you probably heard some kind of. It's like going up and down, like, and it's really slow. It's like the document was developed, and now again I'm putting my Holland Russian here, which I shouldn't do. I'm sorry, but it's a Yof language. We can understand why it is pronounced in that way. The interpretation, and that's the last part in this speech, and it's not that difficult to understand Russian English in terms of the content, but it might be challenging to hear some sayings directly translated into English. So, for instance, there is one saying in Russian which is called "Vek живи, vek учись," which means live 1 century, learn. And I've never seen someone put any of these, but that's something probably. It might be the case if, I don't know, a bilingual person would like translate some from one native language to another. So, for instance, I'm a bilingual child, so I would say that sometimes I can tend to translate a saying which is probably in the English, Swedish, German, Russian, and translate it into any of these languages. Basically, this saying means while you're living, you're learning. So, live 1 century, learn. And while you're living, you're learning. That's what it's meant by that sentence. Everything has its time, and I think I've heard these before in English as well, but it's one you have in Russian as well, also. And probably a native speaker would interpret Russian English as as we said before, it's something it's probably clear, which is a benefit. It's and now again, it depends on what language, because as you've seen here, we've discussed 3 different varieties. So it depends on what kind of variety, of course. Of course, if you're listening on Hollywood Russian, you will probably interpret in a way of, like, I don't know, it's like some kind of brutality or those stereotypes that could appear. Russian English 60 plus, which I mentioned as well. I think that's, that's a good. I mean, you can understand it as long as it's understandable. As long as you understand the content, I don't think there's any problems with it speaking that variety. Of course, it's good if the person tries to speak standard English, but this works as well. Street language, by the way, I think that's something that usually tends to be criticized because, if we would be political correct here, it's even though it's a new developed language, it's like the new part of the society, or the younger part of the society, or some parts of that younger part of the society are trying to portray or like use this kind of language because it sounds cool, as I said. And I think this is I think Russian English I would prefer much better to hear. As conclusion, I'd like to say that we've been discussing the general trends in the Russian accent. We've covered some of the varieties of the Russian accent, for instance, Hollywood Russian, Russian English 60+, and the street languages, as well as how this is interpreted by a native speaker of English. And we've discovered that this is a wide topic for future investigations. Thank you.